Open API specification is a standard mechanism to define structure and syntax of HTTP-based APIs. Using this, you can find out how exactly an API is working without worrying much about the inner details of an API. The best part is Open API specification is language agnostic, meaning I don't need to worry about my implementation language when I am defining a Open API specification. So I can define my Open API specification. After I am done with defining my Open API specification, I can choose any language of my choice. Maybe it will be Java, it can be C# or Node.js or Python. I don't need to worry about what would be my implementation language when I am developing an API. So it will work out in all scenarios flawlessly. Open API specification can be used to describe any kind of API, meaning you can be able to structure out API, what would be the input of a specific API, what would be the output of a specific API, what are the authentication and authorization details of an API while defining a Open API specification of a specific API. You can be able to generate code by using Open API specification. So once you are done with defining structure of a specific API, you can be able to take help of tools to generate code out of that, so that the basic structure of a API will be already readily available when you are starting implementing your API. You can be able to create test cases by using Open API specification. Once you are done with creating Open API specification for a set of APIs, you can hand it off to your test team so that they can leverage on the generated specification to generate test cases for their test cases. Isn't that amazing? Open API specification will be helping you to generate documentation of all your readily available APIs. So that will be helping out to maintain a document for all the available APIs in your application. It will be helping all the developers who needs to understand the functionality in minute details. Also, it will be helping test team to understand the implementation details and what would be the input and output corresponding to any API. There are two ways to define API specification using Open API specification. So first being your code first approach, in which you will be defining the code first, then you are generating the documentation. The second one is your design first approach, in which you will be designing the API contract first. So contract in the sense you will be coming up with what would be the input and what would be the output of a specific API, and that will be handed off to your other team who will be consuming that API, and later in the phase backend team, whoever is responsible for developing that API, they will coming up with the implementation details of that API. Let us discuss about pros and cons of both these approaches in detail. In code first approach, first we will be coming up with implementation of APIs. So all the APIs needs to be implemented completely before generating the document out of it. Once you are done with API implementation, next you will be generating the documentation out of your code base. Once your documentation is done, you will be able to handing it off to any team that will be consuming your code. You will be defining the API right from your code base. So there will be some set of annotations that you will be using to define API description, define the input that your API will be using, define authentication and authorization details from right inside your code. So there is no necessity of learning all these JSON and YAML from code first standpoint of API definition, because you don't be needing to learn about YAML or JSON based specifications. It is the easiest one from the other one as well. So these are the advantages that you will be getting when you are defining API by using code first approach. There are disadvantages as well, because we are relying on defining the code right away and generating the documentation right from our code base. We need to come up with proper implementation of a specific API before handing it off to any other team. As I told before, in code first approach, we need to implement the API first and later on we can be able to generate the documentation by annotating with annotations given by openapi specification. So in this case, because we are defining the API first, there is a waiting time for other team to consume our API. So till the time your code will be ready, they can't be able to take it forward for consuming the API. You have to be very careful to optimize the productivity of your team, because one team needs to wait for API to be delivered so that they can be able to consume later in the phase. Third is because we will be generating documentation right from our code base. In code first approach, you don't have scope for code generation because everything you will be doing, right? So that's a common sense. You won't be having option to generate code in case of code first approach. You are the one who will be generating code. And the last but not the least, there is no scope of sharing code base for consumption in multiple projects of a specific API definition in case of code first approach, because that is hard coded right into your API definition. So you can't be able to share code among the teams. Now let's discuss about what are the advantages and disadvantages of design first approach. In design first approach, first you have to come up with the design of API first. Design in the sense contract of any API. So you don't need to worry about inner implementation details of your API. Rather, you have to just provide what would be the input, what would be the output, and what should be your authentication and authorization details that will be needed by other team. So once you are readily available with these information, you have to write your API specification by using either YAML or JSON based structure. And by using that YAML or JSON based specification, you can be able to generate documentation. That documentation can be handed off to any team that will be aspiring for consuming your API. So for example, if I have a UI team that will be needing my API, then I can hand the documentation to UI team so that they can start working simultaneously. Testing team also can be able to work out their test cases by taking those API specifications and documentation, and simultaneously the backend team who is responsible for developing the API, they can be also able to focus on their work. So API team who is responsible for developing those APIs, they can be able to work out their inner implementation details by the time other teams are consuming the APIs. So here the advantage is all the teams can be able to optimize their productivity by consuming the API early in the phase of your SDLC lifecycle. That is the best part of your API specification using design first approach. Compared to code first approach, in my opinion, design first approach would be the sought after approach for every development team. But there are few scenarios wherein your code first approach will be good to go ahead. When you have a readily available code base already in place, then that is the case where you should be considering code first approach. Otherwise, if you are developing everything from scratch and you are coming up with a code base right from scratch, then in that case, my opinion would be to go ahead with design first approach. So in case of design first approach, there will be better team collaboration because you will be quickly coming up with what would be the input, what would be the output, what are the authentication and authorization details of your set of APIs before developing an API. So you don't need to worry about your inner implementation details of specific API, and you just need to come up with input, output and basic structure and contract of your API, and that will be handed off to your client. Maybe it can be your UI team. So UI team will be consuming your API, just taking that contract. That way you will be optimizing the waiting time that you have found before in the code first approach. So this way you both can work simultaneously without making other two wait. So here is a good benefit that you are getting by optimizing the time and by optimizing the productivity of all the teams that are involved in development. So as I told, code skeleton is readily available early in the phase of your software development lifecycle. One of the best part when it comes to design first approach is you can be able to generate code from your API specifications by using other tools. Automatic code generation helps us to reduce the error and have better collaboration between all the teams that we are working with. Another approach to share code among all other teams that are involved in consuming your API would be to keep your API specification as a separate project. That way you can be able to share that project with other teams. You can be able to share API specifications in multiple teams if you are putting all the API specifications in a different project. That is one of the best parts when it comes to modularity in case of your software development. Compared to your advantages, cons are very few, but there are few cons as well. So you need to learn about JSON and YAML specifications. So how to define API specifications using JSON and YAML, that is something that you have to master. So you have to learn that. That will be taking little bit time and it will be easy. It won't be that complicated, but it has its own learning curve. That you have to keep in mind. Last but not the least, because we are coming up with API contract or API structure early in the phase of our software development lifecycle, there might be possibility that later, because of some small requirement change, you might need to revise your API. So if that would be the case, then again for modifications you have to change the API specification as well as you have to change the place where they will be consumed. So it may be your UI, it may be other services where your API is being used. So all those places needs to be changed because of this particular modification. But in case of code first, there might be possibility of change, but it will be very less, very rare. Why? Because once you are done with all the implementation details, that is when you will be handing it off to other team. So that means by the time you are done with your implementation details of any specific set of API, you will be very sure about your requirements and you will be very sure about your implementation details. So that is where that will be having very less scope of change, whereas in case of design first approach, it will be having little bit more scope of modification. But ultimately, it's up to you how you will be deciding what way you have to choose. If you have already a readily available code base, then my suggestion would be to go ahead with code first approach. But if you are developing something from scratch, then my recommendation would be to go ahead with your API first or design first approach. In a later video, we will be discussing how to implement both approaches by using some examples so that you will be having proper clarity how to actually leverage on open API specification standard and how you can be able to define APIs by using them, how you can be able to consume them in your project. Thank you so much and please do like, share and subscribe if you are liking my video. Seeing you in a different video. Till then, bye bye.